Welcome. Thanks for coming to the third annual Women in Identity and Gaming Symposium. This is our panel. For our panel discussion, we have three guests. We have Jamin Warren, who is the host of PBS Game Show YouTube channel, where a wide variety of topics relating to video games and game culture are discussed. He is also the founder of video game arts and culture magazine Kill Screen, which explores the intersections between games and other forms of cultural media. Next, we have Caroline Hardin. She is the instructional technology and communications assistant at UW-Medicine, where she develops software and provides game design support, among lots of other things. She is also a master's student in digital media and is currently exploring ways to teach computer programming using video games. Next, we have Angela Vanden Elzen. Angela is the Reference and Web Services Librarian and Assistant Professor at Lawrence University. She has published papers on integrating games into academic libraries and library instruction, and has a keen interest in game culture. She is also a member of the WIGS planning group and serves as advisor for the LU Gaming Club. Now, I think to start, maybe we should start with one of the questions that we had written on the board. Do we have those present at all? Or should I just start from one of the questions I have ready? Okay. First question that I have ready is, what do you feel is a good way to address hostile comments from other players while you're gaming or in the gaming community?
Ooh, it's a good one. I can't speak on it, but let's see. Well, so there's this thing in psychology. It's known as the bystander effect, which is that people are less likely, the more number of people you have, the less likely is any individual person is going to act out during like a time of trauma. So that's why they tell you like during like CPR training or like first aid training, if you see someone, you have to point at a specific person and say, you call an ambulance. So there's this weird thing that happens in groups a lot of times where collectively people don't behave in a way that might be good for the group on behalf of a particular individual. This is really hard to do, but I actually think vocally telling someone, like, hey, you're not being a nice person right now, to which your response is almost always like, you know, more meanness, but I do think it's one of those things that we're not acclimated to do as game players, that we just, because of the anonymity, it works both ways. It both allows people to say things that are really nasty, but I think it also allows those of us who know better to not say something because you won't be, you know, if you've ever been like a coffee, or I don't know, a dinner conversation or something like that where someone says something that's really uncomfortable, if no one says anything to address that comment, there's a sort of a sense of complicity there, and that's kind of what happens, I think, a lot of times with online games too.
I think they can do a lot also to have tools for community management built into the game, such as, you know, just being able to unmute people, right, to be able to choose whether your microphone's on and off, and turn other people's microphone off, but also have moderators in the community. I think Reddit does an awesome job of having moderators in a community that decide upon community standards and enforce them. And if the games have more moderators for areas, and then people can choose which area is more welcoming to them, I think that would go a long way. Because right now there's no enforcement. There's nothing you can do other than quit, right? There's no one you can appeal to and be like, this person is being a terrible bully. This person is being completely inappropriate. You have no recourse other than to stop playing the game, which is not really fair.
And I think just kind of just kind of saying what your feelings are and saying, well, actually, that was a really inappropriate comment, and I'm not sure how much worse this would make it, but perhaps it would bring, you know, other players to your side. To be like, actually, that's not an okay thing to say. To kind of remind them that they're talking to another human, that they're playing with other humans, and you know, if they were face to face, perhaps they wouldn't say something like that.
Now, Killing Floor 2 just announced that they're putting in place a policy that if you have a repeated abusive behavior, they will revoke your CD license and just done. You're kicked out of the game, you'd have to buy the game all over again. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, then I'm not going to buy the game because they're censoring my speech. And it's like, that's a terrible reaction to saying we're going to try and have some standards of decency in this community. But I think that they're taking a stand there to say that repeated completely inappropriate behavior is not going to be tolerated by the creators of the game, because trying to stand up for yourself individually against a loud room, you just get shouted down. You know, you have no one has your back. They are just basically saying, we don't care about you as an individual. If the game creators don't put those tools in place, don't have those policies in place, they're saying, we're going to let a mob of very angry people yelling at you have control over the situation.
There's an excellent paper the fellow I mentioned earlier, Jeff Lynn at Riot Games, has published about some of their experiments. And he made a really good observation I never thought about before. He said a very small percentage of players are sort of toxic on a regular, they're just sort of bad people, right? And they said that a lot of times when you isolate a particular incident, it's someone who's had a bad day, or at any given moment, like generally good players kind of have a bad day. And he said one of the problems with some of the structures that we've created around banding is that it sort of treats all behavior equally. It doesn't treat it in context. And obviously you have to create certain standards, obviously, but for them, they've been trying to create a flexible system that allows for not single, like if you have like one, if you say, everyone says things that they regret from time to time out of anger or whatever, so you have to create a system that's flexible enough. Because he said that what happens is that when you ban people, they come back. If you ban them and you don't explain what it is that they did, they come back a lot more.
And there's clearly inappropriate behavior, there's clearly appropriate behavior, and then there's a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so where you throw that line down could be very controversial. And so that's where they Killing Floor 2 said it's going to be all about repeated behavior, patterns of abuse.
Yeah.
And that's going to be tested, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I think one of the biggest reasons, I really feel like one of the reasons why this has become such an issue is I think that the development team, like if there was more, I earnestly believe that, if the CEO of Twitter was a woman, I feel like it wouldn't have taken them 8 years to all of a sudden deal with, because I just feel like if you were a white male, you're oftentimes in a community of other people who are developing these systems. It's just like not very high on the concerns list because you're looking at features.
Not facing it. You're not living it. I mean, even things about Twitter like you can only put one real name. What if you got married and changed your name?
Yeah.
Like and you're a professional and you want to maintain some professional continuity. I found that out and I was like, wait, Twitter just doesn't care about me and the problems I face around having a name as a female in society. Like just ignores that completely. And I feel like if there were more females on Twitter, they'd be like, wait, I want to be able to have my 2 names so that people can if I change my name when I get married, like people can still find me.
Yeah.
Right?
Big problems.
So having more women involved on the creation and decision is really important because otherwise these things just get really overlooked or not thought about or they don't have a big priority.
Yeah.
So
that's very true.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, what are some ways you feel that publishers and game developers can help to make games more inclusive, and why don't they?
I think we addressed some of that is that they, it's inclusive to them. And commercially they haven't been punished commercially for appealing to a very small segment,
Yeah. Well, I mean that's it's relative, right? Typically in other markets, like if you're putting together a business plan and you say there's a large population of people who have yet to be served by this thing that would be treated as like a business opportunity, not as a rationalization for why we should stay the course. Because that's typically how it is. Like I hear responses from from folks in games like, well, it's this tautological thing where it's like, well, women don't play games. And
therefore, we don't have to make games
therefore
for
we
women.
don't have to make games for women.
And because we don't make games for women, women don't play games.
And in any other, if you were starting a business, you're like, oh my gosh, there's this huge audience of people who are not being served even remotely. You would say we need to start an entire company to focus on. You wouldn't use that as a rationale for not making. Right. It's very weird. Games are very backwards that way. So, and you see it in every other medium. I mean, women are responsible for the vast majority of book sales. They're just over 50% of ticket sales for movies, and yet, and I think we mentioned earlier, literature is better than a lot of other places, but certainly in film, even though women are economically supporting some of these cultural systems, and yet, there doesn't seem to be the same. The game designers don't feel the same compunction to try and make things that, at least at some level might be open to a wider set of audiences, which I don't think means making games for women per se. I think it just means reflecting a nice diversity. So, I don't know. What do you all think?
What we said before, having more women involved in the decision-making process, having more conversations about, pointing out, like, look, when you have the armor designed like this, where you're like having bare midriffs and stuff like that breaks the fantasy. It's unrealistic. It tends to be aggressive towards female players because then they're seen as not a real serious warrior. They're more eye candy, These types of conversations I think are really important because if you don't point these things out, I don't think it's thought about. It's like, oh, that's just the way it's always been done. You'd be like, oh, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. Just these conversations I think are going to help a lot, and then getting more women to feel like they can be active in creating it. We're not just passive consumers, but we're making it. I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. And I think another part of it is getting the existing people in the game creating community to be comfortable with creating characters that may not necessarily be just their experience in the world or the experience of the games they've already played. Learning how to reach out to other people or do research and try to portray a character that actually shows another type of a woman, or like an accurate woman, and not just the eye candy type, or somebody of a different race, or someone with a different experience growing up. It's easy to create someone completely different, like someone like an alien race or someone out in space or something, but for some reason it seems like it's really difficult to create like accurate people who are separate from the typical characters that we get.
And perhaps some of that is opening up the sandboxing more. Minecraft is this amazing sandbox, except for you're in Steve's body with the beard, right? And you can shape the world, but you can't shape your own body at all. And so I love these games where they allow you to spend, and I spend way too much time on it, of course, like picking your face and your body shape and your skin tone and everything, your height, all of that. I think just like rather than having the designers of the game say, this is who you are as a character, open that up too. I mean, I don't want to hear this nonsense about, oh, it's too expensive, or what was it, Assassin's Creed? It was like, it's too hard to make women's bodies.
It took too long.
It took too long. And it's just like really, like, so let's open it up for sandboxing the identity a lot more, and I think we'll be surprised and impressed by what people come up with.
Tomb Raider, I believe the newest Tomb Raider is the best-selling version of that franchise. Which then begs this question, like, if Tomb Raider had started in this place, as opposed to sort of like buxom Lara Croft, I wonder, like, I mean, obviously those games sold incredibly well, but the newest one, which has like a much more reasonable body type, a very different kind of character, if they had started there, 15 years ago, it makes you wonder how much more money they possibly could have made if they hadn't initially tried to position Lara Croft as this sort of like sexy character. It's funny, I did this episode for a game show on whether or not Link could be a woman, and I got all this feedback from the comments about, I was like, that's fine, you can do that, but make it a separate game, in the Zelda universe, but it can't be Link. And it's funny, it's like you go through the Legend of Zelda, it's this failure of imagination. It's like Link can be like a young boy, he can be a Deku, a Goron, like he can be different races, he can turn into different creatures, but like the one thing
can't change
gender. Yeah, exactly. Changes gender and
that's too much.
That's too much. That's way too much. So it's funny, like people are willing to accept all types of fantasies except for ones that are not fantasies, which is like women who exist in the real world. We're willing to accept all of these other things. So it's very funny.
Like Mass Effect, it's the same game. You get to pick male or female, and even that's a very binary, choice on gender. But it's progress that you can just choose.
Yeah. It's Maggie Gyllenhaal, who she won a Golden Globe, and she gave this amazing talk, or just her acceptance speech at the Golden Globes this last year for the Honorable Woman. She made this really good point, which is she was talking about, it's great that there are all these, sort of strong women on television, but she's like, what I'm more interested in is having strong women and weak women and good women and bad women and creating a diversity of characters. And so it's great we have like a Lara Croft type character, but it's great to have like female villains and some women who are in positions of strength and some women who are in positions of weakness. And like adding that kind of complexity. And I think that television has been so much like richer for having this variety of different types of female characters that on shows that like men and women can watch together. So I hope the same thing for games. That's my hope.
There was a book that came out recently, I don't forget the title, where they deliberately did not define the gender. What was it called?
Lock-in.
Lock-in. They deliberately, who wrote that?
John Scalzi.
John Scalzi wrote Lock-in, where he deliberately did not designate the gender of the main character, ever. And there's two versions of the audiobook, one read by a male, one read by a female. So you get to choose for yourself what you think the gender, at least on a binary spectrum, what do you think the gender of the character is. And it's like, we could be doing this in computer games, you know, it's even easier because you can, you know, generate it as you go.
Yeah.
So it is a failure of imagination, I think.
Jim had talked earlier in the answering to this question about games geared towards women versus games geared towards men, and game advertising and marketing and stuff like that. Perhaps having games that are marketed more towards women because it's, you know, this revenue that isn't being tapped. And I mean, that reminds me of, does anyone remember the Dr. Pepper brand, like Dr. Pepper 10, which was specifically for men?
It's not for women.
I remember watching an ad for that and going, that's really dumb. You are cutting your potential, you know, group of people who are going to buy this product in half just by saying that. And I thought that was pretty dumb. But it kind of leads into another question, which is there is this perception within the gaming community that men and women prefer different kinds of games or different games in general. What is your thought about this sentiment or this idea?
I feel like why can't we just make games for people, right? Because you get into these stereotyped areas. Like, I read once they made a laptop for women, right? And they had features. I know, right? It was like pink, right? And so it had features such as a laptop latch you could open with long nails. And I was like, okay, on one hand, that's incredibly patronizing, like, you know, oh, what women want in a laptop is to be able to open it with their fancy nails. On the other hand, lots of women do have fancy nails. So you get into this line between targeted it towards a group without defining that group with very limited bounds, right? Without saying, oh, you only like these things. So I think you got to be really careful around that. But some stuff, like I do a lot of work in e-textiles, and one reason I do it is because it is traditionally women feel more comfortable around textiles and soft circuits versus soldering circuits, and so it opens up programming to them in a way that is an easier threshold. But of course, there are plenty of women who love soldering and love real circuits and stuff. So it's a careful line of like making it more friendly towards without saying, oh, you're over in this corner with the pink things.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a real challenge. It's funny. It made me think of for the BIC for Women. On Amazon, the reviews for BIC for Women are pretty funny. I mean, one of the nice things about games is that I think games cut away. The nature of what games are, I think, oftentimes cut away a lot of different things. So, where you're from, what language you speak, like your gender, all these different things kind of can fall to the background. And games, I think, allow for this like very pure experience. And I think that's one of the things in terms of like marketing for like marketing games towards women, instead of thinking about them as this like monolithic category. Like I find this with my wife, for example. She doesn't play a lot of games, so it's been interesting for me. She knows that she likes the idea of playing games, but she doesn't know which types of games she wants to play. So I discovered like adventure style games are not. She just doesn't like those. Not because of the subject matter. She just that type of digital interaction is just like isn't particularly appealing to her. But she loves puzzle games, for example. And so that's like a weird thing where, you know, I'm sure if you took like a point and click adventure game that was ostensibly like marketed towards women, that wouldn't necessarily appeal to her because she doesn't like that type of interaction. So it's both a promise and I'm sure it's a very real challenge. And I think like you're saying, like instead of trying to market, I think to men and to women, I think creating a wide variety of different types of experiences makes it much more likely that you're going to get more equity in terms of the things that are played. So yeah, I mean, The Sims is a great example, which there's much more equity in terms of like the player base there for The Sims, and I don't think it's because like women like playing house more or something like that. But The Sims was a very different type of game at that time, and I think that's what the appeal was there. This idea of control, and you're able to tell these stories, and there's something kind of I like The Sims too. So
I think you could also, rather than trying to market to women, I think you can make things that appeal to women. I think you can do stuff that just remove the stuff that turns women off.
Yeah.
Right? If you remove a bunch of the things that women are complaining about, I think that would go a long way. Like the focus on scantily clad characters, et cetera, et cetera. Remove those things we're complaining about, I think would just help a lot. But yeah, I mean, women like all sorts of games and men like all sorts of games, and that's fine. We don't all need to play Pretty Princess Pony Party,
I love
fashion
Pretty
designer
Princess Pony
game,
Party, though.
or whatever. They think women want to do interior decorating games. It's like, really. On the other hand, it would be cool if there were more of that. I guess Sims is kind of an interior decorating game.
And I was just thinking that, we all do grow up, or many of us grow up with such explicit gendered messages and what we should and shouldn't like. So on one hand, with them making interior decorating game, well, if they would, and the Pretty Princess Pony Adventure, then girls will be like, oh, that's for me because I've been told my whole life that's for me. But if we could just, somehow change the perceptions, like how you said, taking out the things that bother women, and somehow just make them a little more games and game advertisements more neutral, more welcoming to all, that could really change a lot. Like I read an article about how the argument of the article was that if only more women played games, like more aggressive games, like first-person shooters that are so geared and advertised toward men these days, or as they are, I should say, that could actually really help women in their everyday lives, help make women more assertive. And she was giving all kinds of examples about like how it could help in the workplace and in our everyday lives. And I just thought that, I'm not sure I 100% agreed with her, but it was a really interesting perspective, saying that like by having women play these games which are so masculinized, it could possibly help change part of our larger gender stereotypes.
More masculine?
I don't know, maybe just by tearing down some of those stereotypes and allowing women to feel comfortable in a different type of role than we're always told that we should be in. I thought it was a really interesting perspective.
I think there's a lot of invisible female players in first-person shooters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know any female gamers who don't play first-person shooters. Then they love them and they enjoy them. What they don't like is the community of verbal abuse that happens. They don't like being excluded. They don't like telling they're a fake gamer or who's only doing it to get attention, all that. It just gets in the way of you enjoying the game, and it becomes so much static and friction that you're like, why am I even doing this anymore? But I'm not sure, playing first-person shooters will make you more like men, which will help you.
It was an interesting argument. It was, I don't know.
Well, I think it's based off of the understanding that masculine and feminine are cultural constructions.
Yeah.
And
And
expanding,
polar opposites.
and expanding the idea that both men and women can have and use aspects of femininity and masculinity as we in our Western culture understand them, and that one is not inherently better than the other. There are certainly aspects to masculine traits that are very helpful, which is part of the reason why the male gender is the dominant one in our culture, why we have the patriarchy. So, and there are a lot of women who feel restricted and as though they cannot actually use those traits that they do have within them because they're not supposed to be inherent to them.
Right.
I think that's where you're coming from. Am I right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Caroline had mentioned taking out the elements of games that are turning women off and making them more female friendly. And I'm going to ask this question. I know it may be stupid. I'm just interested to hear your answers. What would you say to the argument that taking out the stuff that turns women off, making it more female friendly, would then make it male unfriendly or boring to male players?
Well, and that's such a small part of what games actually are. And I mean, I would imagine a lot of men, well, I shouldn't speak for all, but it seems like a lot of them don't play the games for the boobs, or, you know, they play it for all of the other things, for the gameplay and the entertainment, and but I'm not sure if that part was missing, if all of a sudden, like, if there was a game without that, if you would hear this huge uproar, like, where were all the scantily clad women? You know, the women were probably
So, I hear the argument made.
Go back to your GameStop.
We shouldn't.
You told me there were boobs in this.
There's not enough
Take
boobs.
it back.
So that, you know, we shouldn't constrain creativity, and there's nothing wrong with the games we have, and they're lots of fun. And then part of that, those fantastical images of women are part of the fun and the appeal, and taking it away is censorship. And I'm like, you know what? Like, if you're a giant games company, you have a civic responsibility to be perpetuating a positive model of culture. Like, right? I mean, we wouldn't accept other types of behavior in games, and we don't often in society. We complain about them when they come out, that there's very terrible racist stereotypes in games. Like, there's a conversation around that, right? So I think we need to, as a culture, we get to choose what is, you know, part. Are there going to be a subclass of games where it's women in thong bikinis, you know? Yes, and that's fine, and there's people who that'll appeal to, but I'm tired that being told that the mainstream, millions of dollars invested in games, have to have these features in order to sell. You know, that doesn't feel right or good.
Yeah, it's interesting. The woman who spoke, Ashley Birch, I guess she spoke last year. She released a study. Her and another woman did some research on the preferences of, I guess it's like teenage boys and girls. And what they found was that that young girls over-indexed in that they were very interested in having a character on screen that represented them, whereas young boys didn't really care at all. Like, which basically means that, like, what they were saying was, like, that young boys don't care as much. There was, like, sexy women on screen so much. They were interested in sort of, like, is it a good game or not? And women are interested in those same things, but have this extra additional attract. You know, young boys don't have to think about that stuff because so many of the characters, the default is male, so they're not thinking about that stuff. But it also means, on the flip side, that they're not coming to games because they're looking for sex symbols or anything like that. You know, it's interesting. I joked about Furious 7 earlier, and you know, there's very little. I mean, believe it or not, there's, like, not a ton of sexualization in that film. The cast is a majority minority, and it's one of the highest grossing films ever. And it's not one of these things where they sell it as, like, Furious 7, a progressive tale of, like, you know, women who are just as capable as men. They don't sell it like that, right? But I feel like that is a big piece of the movie, that you do have, you know, I mean, I guess the cars make everyone equal, right? I guess is the idea. So it's interesting. You can have, I think that it's one of those things where I think if you do include this stuff, it is an active detriment, I think, to women wanting to participate in these communities. But if you take that stuff out, I don't think guys aren't going to, they're not going to be bothered necessarily.
And not just women, but also, like, a wide variety of people. There's saying that the most important audience is those who want to look at sexualized versions of women is excluding so many groups.
Yeah.
You know, people of the LGBT community, and people of, you know, who have different religious orientations and stuff. You're just excluding them all. You say your views don't matter. And I mean, with games these days, it could be an option, it could be a mod, it could be something you add on. Why is it the default? So.
This makes me think of, if anyone remembers, Angelina Jolie, who had a double mastectomy because she found that she was at high risk for breast cancer. And the public outcry afterwards. There was big backlash, especially from the male community, about taking away the boobs, which is, you know, relates to pop culture because, you know, the majority of movies and acting that she does, she is used a lot, not necessarily for her acting talent, but for her physical appearance, which leads me to one of the questions that I had put up on the questions for the panel board, which is how do games and gaming culture fit within the larger scope of popular media in a culture that we have that is so driven by popular media?
Well, it's interesting. As someone who, I've covered music, I've covered film. I just as a, formerly as a journalist, covered a lot of different types of mediums. I think that the frustration of games is that in some ways they are, the politics in games tend to be far more retrograde than maybe any other medium that I've kind of looked at. But I think it's only because it's a bit. I think a lot of it has to do with its relative age, and I think there's a lot of reasons why. But games, for the most part, I think have been insulated from like actual cultural criticism, both within the academy and from actual working critics. I think that's a big piece of it, and that sort of stuff helps push a medium along. If you don't have people sort of suggesting that like, oh, some of the things that you've sort of portrayed are problematic, then you don't ever seek to change them. But I think the promise is that games are one of the most commercially viable mediums on the planet as well. So it means that there's something there. It's clearly it's resonating with people a lot. So I think that, the nice thing about games, my hope is that they can have it both ways, and that they're both commercially very successful. Even for you even look for smaller independent developers. I mean, you don't see a game like Gone Home, for example, a game I really enjoyed a lot. It sold like 500,000 units, which is a lot. That's a lot of individual copies, and you don't see a lot of independent musicians, selling 500,000 copies of something. Maybe 500,000 singles, but not 500,000, full lengths or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's hard because I think for a lot of people, games are a model. They look at games, they see promise, and they see the future. At the same time, I feel like games can be very slow. I think the thing that excites me is I think most of the changes that are going to happen. This came up earlier. We were talking about distribution. We're talking about distribution and trying to get like independent games out in front of a wider audience. The thing that excites me is that I think there are more people outside of the game playing community than there are inside of it, and I think that that's the audience. Once I think a lot of the cultural baggage around games hopefully dissipates, that's the audience that I think is going to make some of these more progressive titles, whatever they might be. I think those have so much potential, but if you're just looking at the existing games community right now, I don't know if there are enough people there. But the good thing is like there's lots and lots of people in this world. So
yeah. Talking about the distribution, I think games are in a good position because books, you have to convince a publisher to print a certain number of copies, unless you're talking about ebooks, right? Talking about non-digital content. Movies, you have to convince a movie theater to run your film, right? Whereas games, it's like once it's up on Steam, you can blog about it, you can tweet about it. As many people as want to come to that game can play it. Like, you don't have to convince anyone else to be a gatekeeper as far as making it available, right? It is available to everyone who wants it to be available. So I think there's a lot of promise there as people start responding to the criticisms around these games are not meeting our cultural needs, and games start coming up that do, that we should be celebrating and talking about them and sharing them with our friends as much as possible. Because that's going to bring the audience, which allows the money to come, which allows developers to spend more time making more games like this, because it is very resource intensive to make a really good game. But the audience, if we say we want those games, we should be playing them and supporting them. That will make more of them. So,
going back to something that Jamin said about the criticism, it seems that for many years the only criticism that was applied to video games was done by fans, and it was, and so now if anybody who can be perceived as not a fan tries to criticize the game or put the same type of criticism that like movies and books have been getting for years, that person is immediately perceived as not within the gaming community because they're applying this other type of criticism that's not consistent with past criticism, or just or maybe it's in a different venue, like if it's on a blog, or if it's just in a different type of magazine, or somebody who even looks different than them is reporting it.
Plus, the other big criticism towards games is that playing these first-person shooters makes you more violent, right? Which is empirically false, right? There's zero evidence, right? And so I feel like maybe from that because of that, because there is this large cultural, parents and school administrators stuff saying, oh, games are bad for these reasons, and then it turned out to really not be true, that as these new types of complaints around gender issues are coming up, maybe because of that legacy, they're like, oh, well, this is also a false complaint.
Yeah.
Right? You said it'd make us more violent, which is not true. You're saying that over-gendered games creates gender cultural issues. Well, that's also not true. Unfortunately, it is. It does have real effects. So I wonder if that legacy of the people who are criticizing them, not really having any facts behind them, is now an issue.
Yeah, I think one other big problem is that game makers have traditionally been very silent in terms of, you look at the first round of kind of the moral panic around violence in video games, and the makers, I like a lot of Rockstar's games, but when Grand Theft Auto started coming under the spotlight, the company was they were silent, absolutely silent. They wouldn't even stand up and say, well, this is our right as artists, and we can make things that are like this. And you look at other mediums, when Marilyn Manson was going through that in the 90s, he wrote like a big op-ed in the New York Times about his right as an artist to say X, Y, and Z things. I mean, there's a long legacy of kind of, regardless, even people who make things I don't agree with, standing up and saying, like, this is our right as artists, this is our sort of free speech right. And I think that's been one of the, same with Doom in the 90s, the creators, id Software, like they were just silent, right? And I think it's been one of the nice things I do think about some of the stuff, the conversations that have been happening around gender, I think is that you are starting to see more, whether it's the CEO of Blizzard going in front of their convention and being like, look, this industry has a gender problem, this is something that we're going to fix, or Anita Sarkeesian being invited by different game companies. That is one of them that I think there's definitely more of a conversation there than there was. But I think until game makers are more public about, like this is an issue, and you look at Intel, for example, is, basically dedicating, I guess like $400 million over the next decade to try to increase, basically now it's like we have a problem internally as a company, this is something that we need to fix. So it's a good, it's a good news, bad news situation. But I do think that, at the heart of, I think at the heart of it is that, what I mentioned earlier is that the idea, the gamer as an identity, gamer as a term is a little tough because it both is a realm of human activity, it is the most effective way to describe what you do when you play games, but it's also a social identity. And I think that those two ideas have come into conflict where you have this huge audience of people who are gamers because they play games, but do not identify as gamers as a social identity. And so I think as that audience starts to grow, it's like very natural criticism. It's like, hey, there's some things in this community that are really bad, whether it's toxic behavior online or portrayal of female characters or whatever. Very reasonable, but it kind of cuts at the heart of the gamer as identity piece. And so then people turn to, well, you're just not a part, you just wouldn't get it because you're not a part of this world, which is just really unfortunate. But.
Right. I think there's always a little bit of small corners of culture that pushes the envelope in areas and goes too far and stuff. I think it's healthy for society to have some of those pockets because they give us something to be like, to look at and go, you know what, those are not our values, right? You don't want to completely stamp out, a behavior in arts and culture that you're like, that makes you uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean that we don't get to have a say in it and we don't want to have a conversation with it and that we don't, ask things to be better, right? That we're just passive, like, well, we got to take it however they give it to us, I think it's always a struggle. There's always a cultural struggle. And you don't want to censor ideas. On the same hand, you want people to be responsible. So.
Okay, before I move on to my last few questions, does anyone in the audience have any questions for our panelists? Jay.
So related to what you both were just talking about, how do you start to introduce other people to these kind of ideas? How do you introduce someone to what we're talking about here at WIGS today? If, say they've been playing games their entire life, or maybe they don't even play games at all. Like, how do you approach these types of issues in a way that, they'll take it well and they'll kind of start to critically think about this as we have been doing for, years, months, however long we've been doing this. So.
I think you talked a lot about the us versus them, that tribe versus my tribe. So I think, establishing at the beginning a base of I'm in the same tribe as you. I also play games. I also love these games, right? Because people get so defensive so quickly, right? And then being like, but I wish, my armor didn't expose most of my skin, you know. I think that helps. People are really defensive right now about these issues.
I mean, I think engaging face to face is always preferable. I mean, there's a couple of things. I think one is, I mean, yeah, I think what you're saying is really true. Establishing that sense of like, hey, look, we share a love of the same thing, and the good news is, I mean, history is on your side. Like Ada Lovelace sort of set the foundations for the modern computer, and there are a host of early Grace Hopper, who was Navy's first lady of code, and there are all these Donna Bailey and Carol Shaw, and there are all these women who are working in games, and even now there's someone like Corinne Yu who worked on Halo's engine. So I think for one, you can say like, look, there's not a ton of them, but they've women have occupied some very important positions. They're part of this history, this shared lineage that we share, and so you would hope that the woman who set the stage for the modern computer would feel comfortable playing games online, like this thing that she essentially enabled. So I think that's one big piece of it. I think the other one is like, there's in conflict resolution, there's this idea that you want to create what's called a pool of shared meaning, which is like, what are the sets of concerns that we share collectively? And Tari, I do a lot of speaking like on Gamergate stuff, and I get a lot of, I think because I'm a guy, sometimes I think that sometimes men feel more comfortable saying like, wow, I feel like this Gamergate thing kind of appeals to me, and I think it's really important to ask, like, I think on the one hand, there's a tendency to be like, you're a terrible person, why would you want to associate yourself with this thing? But on the other hand, it's like, I think if you want to cut to the heart, like, well, what is it that is appealing about this? Clearly this is meeting some sort of need in your life. It's addressing some sort of concern, and I do think that there is this fear. I think that, and this is the place where I think you can engage. There's a fear that this thing that you love is somehow going to be, not that it's going to be made worse, but it's going to be made different. Like I went to an all-boys high school, for example. I think that a lot of the resistance to the idea of having like women in school was like, not because being in an all-boys school was better or whatever. I mean, it was great for me as a kid, but I think it's this idea that like, oh, well, if women are involved or girls are involved, all of a sudden this thing that I love is going to somehow, and I think it comes from a place of fear. And I think engaging with that can be really useful, that like, look, no, this is going to be like my involvement in this thing that you love is going to make it that much better. There are going to be some people who are just jerks, obviously. I mean, that's just kind of the way of the world. But I do think that there is a silent majority, a very silent group that feels like, particularly men that feel like this was our thing, and I'm worried that my thing is going to be somehow less good. And I think if we can come to that without condemning people, even if you disagree, I think that's a good place to start having that conversation. So
I think if you find the games that are more appealing to you, you celebrate them, and you go, well, look, try this game. What do you think? And they go, yeah, this is also a fun game. You go, see, it's still fun. We can still have really awesome games with more people participating, which makes it more fun. These other elements are really just getting in the way, and we're not going to take them away from you. We're not going to water games down to where they're not fun anymore. But we are saying it would be more fun if you opened it up a little and experimented with more diversity. It's going to make it better.
Good points. And I was just thinking, I think a person has to be comfortable with or ready to have that uncomfortable conversation, perhaps with close friends. Because personally, I talk about this stuff at work all the time, and I talk about it with my husband, but I've never talked about it with my friend group of gamers who are mostly guys. And I was trying to think of a good reason for that, but it's that whole idea of, well, if I bring up this point, maybe they wouldn't, maybe it would cause some kind of confrontation or make personal relationships a little bit different. And I think we just need to be brave. And like you were saying, bring up games that do have really good examples of characters and diversity, and talk about the different, or the reasons why those are so good, and why this other person might also like that game, how we should give it a chance. But yeah, I think as an individual, it seems like maybe that's a good place to start, like have those uncomfortable conversations with our peers and friends.
So my question is, like, I've had a lot of arguments with, playing Bayonetta in the last couple weeks with people wondering if she's a good, like, female character, but based off of whatever they don't like about her, being scantily clad, based on other women in games, they wonder what makes a good female character in games. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, what makes a good female character?
I think a lot of what makes a good character, what makes a good male character and what makes a good female character is having realistic, rich history to them, and having an options to customize it. And so when you have things like the only options are scantily clad, that's really narrowing down the identity, which really makes them a shallower character, which is just less fun. I think, like you were saying about the TV shows, like having strong female characters and weak female characters, I want to have the option to play, a diversity of female characters and kind of choose that for myself. That's what makes it a good character, but when you narrow things, you're saying, okay, we're going to restrict it, well, you can only be in this area. I think that really weakens it.
Yeah. Bayonetta's a tough one. It is a tough one because it's hard not to discuss the context, who makes a game, right? That is actually very important. So like it's funny, the conversation about Bayonetta is very similar to like the conversations around like Madonna or Nicki Minaj, right? Which is these questions about like if you have a woman who sexuality is an asset of hers and she's using it in a particular way, it becomes very complicated because in both Madonna and Nicki Minaj, they're working in mostly male industry. The music videos are being created, generally speaking, by men, even if the artist has a straw. It becomes very complex. Whether or not, I think there's a good case to be made on either side that Bayonetta is either like a sort of a feminist icon or kind of like a gross male gazy kind of eye candy. I think you can make a good argument in either case. I think the reason why it's complicated is because there isn't a variety of characters in which she sits, right? And so when you put her alongside of, like a legacy of like Lara Croft and other or there's a game I was playing, a game I love, this game Enslaved: Journey to the West, which is done by Ninja Theory. It's a really great game. It's a retelling of this Chinese folk tale, and like it's awesome. However, the female lead, I was playing it and my girlfriend, now wife, she came in, and like the female lead is like, face of a teenager, like really unreasonable body types or whatever. And this is a game I genuinely enjoy. So it's very hard you can't just separate what's happening with Bayonetta from, if you'd like to line up all of the female characters in games. But yeah, it's interesting. I think the hope is, if you look at a show like Sex and the City, for example, there are a variety of different sort of views of female sexuality on that show. If the show is all Samantha, right, that would be a very different type of show than if you had this sort of different women bringing different sort of perspectives to the table. So I don't know. I think what makes a good character, I think what makes a really good character is, I think, context and I think ultimately diversity. Not necessarily diversity in the game itself. Just like if all that was on television was like anti-hero stuff with like Breaking Bad, right? If every character was like someone that you really, or House of Cards, right? Like if every character was this like Machiavelli.
Or all you had was Rambo.
Right, if all you had was Rambo.
Every Rambo, every show. There's nothing wrong with Rambo as a character.
Right, exactly.
The problem is there's not a spectrum. There's nothing wrong with Bayonetta as a character. It's just that we're not seeing anything but people like Bayonetta, right. And that gets to be that's the problem more.
Yeah, I think that. So, and, in terms of like what makes a good character, it's hard. You can't evaluate them in a vacuum. But you do have to look at them against sort of what's available at the time. So, but yeah.
And it's unfortunate that people are so apprehensive about liking Bayonetta, and like one of my favorite games, Final Fantasy X too, and I'm apprehensive about admitting that because people will say, well, that's just a game with a bunch of girls running around in short shorts and like tiny outfits, and it is, but there are so many other things I enjoyed about it, and the character, it's a continuation of a previous story, so there's a very good character development, but kind of all that gets kind of covered up, and same with Bayonetta, it seems like a lot of the really good stuff gets covered up by her tiny outfits and hair outfit. I don't even know exactly what it was, but yeah, and that's just unfortunate that it is the case, and it might be because that is pretty much all we see elsewhere. That it can't just be part of her, just part of who she is, but the fact that I don't know, it's just everywhere. So it's like kind of covers up this really great character.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, then I have one final question, which is, where do you think we are heading? So just like, imagine yourself 1 year from now, WIGS is happening again, hopefully. What are we talking about? What are the kinds of things that are we going to be addressing? Is it all the same? Is nothing going to change? Or do you think there will be new problems or new issues?
Or
I mean, like,
solutions.
yeah, for example, like Gamergate was something that came up, and we had a panel discussion. We hosted a panel discussion on Gamergate, and Gamergate has been mentioned a few times today. So where do you think we'll be a year from now?
I kind of hope that Gamergate will be this thing of the past, and we'll have a resolution and be like, and remember how this is how we came together and fixed Gamergate.
I think Gamergate really made acute some of the problems that had always been there, right? They'd always been there under the surface. And so I think, and because of just how extreme it is and how just outrageous the behavior of some people is, I think it's really pushing these companies to be like, we can't associate with this. We do need harassment policies. We do need ways, moderation. We do need ways for people to ban people. Like, we do need to not allow people to run rampant in other groups. I think Gamergate can serve the community by pushing us to be better, by making it so explicit. It's not comfortable right now, though.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'm sure, like, if you are a public investor in Twitter, for example, and you're looking at, like, Twitter's generally flat growth, I'm sure the Gamergate stuff actually sits in your mind. Like, well, maybe it's because your platform allowed this thing to fester, and you're chasing every week. There's a different celebrity. It's like, I can't be on Twitter anymore because I get so much hateful stuff. So I don't want to say it's good, because I don't think human suffering is ever like a good thing. But I think, again, it makes it a lot easier. I think it's one of these things that allows men who have not experienced that to be like, I don't know what your gender politics are, but like that's really messed up. Like clearly, like that's really, really messed up, and people inserting themselves in your conversations and whatnot. I tend to be, I try to be an optimist. There's Martin Luther King said, it was ascribed to Martin Luther King, but that the arc of history is long but bends towards justice. And it's sort of a funny, talking about this stuff is sort of funny because in a weird way, like I don't want to have to keep talking about it, right? You kind of want to. I don't think anybody's pleased about talking about it. So in a weird way, you kind of want this conversation to not exist anymore, because it will just be like you won't have to complain about X, Y, and Z thing, because there will be a diversity of characters. That said, I do think there are a lot of really positive signs, and I think it is getting a little harder every year. I feel like there are more examples that you can point to. The Tomb Raider example is a good one, and you're certainly seeing that on the independent game side, games like Gone Home, and so and it's really good. I mean, I feel like there's definitely way more, whether it's Clementine from The Walking Dead. I feel like there is, and one of the big things with games is that because it's such a young medium, a lot of the guys who started it are now in their 40s and 50s, and a lot of them have daughters. We had Tim Schafer spoke at our first festival, and this is one of the things that he said about Broken Age, was that he realized, like, for him as a game designer, because he has a daughter, he started looking at the games that his daughter was playing, and he's like, they're so few. He's like trying to introduce her to, like, oh, this is like the class. These are all these games I worked on, and the classic canon of games. And he's like, there aren't that many younger. It's like, who's making characters for my daughter? So it does kind of hit home a little bit, and I think we forget that sometimes, that sort of the elder statesmen of the world of games are all pretty, generally speaking, pretty young. They're just, their kids are starting to grow up and whatnot. I think that's triggering some conversations for them internally. Like, maybe I should be making games that my daughter can see someone who looks like her on screen.
Yeah. So as the community matures, they're starting to realize that they have a connection to other perspectives too. They're not just writing games for themselves; they might be writing them for their daughters.
Yeah.
And that matters. But I think you're right. The Gamergate has really brought to the forefront that this is a problem, we do need to do something with it. And I think next year we'll be able to talk about these are that we're still figuring out as a community what the solutions are. We're not sure, right? That's why we come together and talk about it. But I think we'll be able to say, this company did that, and this company did this, and this is a super promising model, and boy, that thing fell flat, right? I think it's really promising. There's a lot of good energy, and it makes me excited.
And this is our third Women in Identity and Gaming Symposium, and I can say, like, as you know, it really has. You know, our conversation is different every year. We have different things to talk about, so I feel it feels like things are being resolved as time passes, but new issues continue to come up. Unfortunately, previous years we didn't have something as big as Gamergate, but you know, there were always news items that would come up that we would have to talk about, and I don't know if there will be a day where there isn't an issue relating to women and identity in gaming that we'll be able to discuss. I mean, maybe everything will be resolved. I mean, but there are more and more indie games coming out, and you know, so that has improved over the years since we started this. But I mean, maybe someday we'll just become an identity in gaming symposium. You know, since all gamers who identify as a gamer as their identity, you know, I think, or many might still want a space in which to discuss that identity.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
maybe it'll just evolve.
I think my hope is maybe in the future it would be less reactive and more proactive. So it would be, you know, a celebration of the characters that do exist.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah. Let's rather than talk about what we wish we could see, let's talk about what we do see that we love. That would be really great.
Yeah.
Okay, this has been wonderful. That's all the time we have for this, but we do have a Games Expo going on the third floor, which is one floor above here, which has a number of board games and computer games with little descriptions. They all have trigger warnings on them, so just be aware, but you can read the description and try a few of them out. Thank you.